The cold air hit my face the moment I stepped outside, sharp and biting like 1,000 tiny needles against my skin. The world was still, muffled by the thick layer of snow that blanketed everything in sight. The cabin behind me was dark, my family still asleep inside, unaware that I had already laced up my running shoes and was heading out for my usual morning jog. I had always been an early riser. Something about the quiet before the world woke up had always drawn me in. Especially in winter, when everything felt frozen in time, the air crisp and untouched. This trip to Lake Placid, New York, was supposed to be a relaxing family getaway, a break from the monotony of post-college life. But sitting around all day by the fire, playing board games and sipping cocoa, wasn't exactly my idea of fun. I needed movement, solitude. The trailhead was just beyond the tree line, a winding path that cut through the forest and eventually looped back near Mirror Lake. I had spotted it the day before while we were unloading the car, and it seemed perfect, quiet, secluded, untouched. That morning, the snow on the path was pristine except for a few scattered animal tracks. My breath came out in thick clouds as I started jogging, my shoes crunching against the snow. The silence of the woods was comforting at first, almost peaceful. Until I noticed the footprints. They were faint at first, barely visible beneath the powdery snow, but as I ran further, they became clearer. Sneaker prints. Someone else had been here before me. It wasn't unusual. Lake Placid was a popular spot, and I figured it was another runner who had set out before dawn. But something about the way the footprints stretched ahead of me didn't sit right. They weren't in a steady rhythm, like someone jogging at a consistent pace. Instead, they were uneven, erratic, as if the person had been stopping, hesitating, or staggering. A strange sensation crept up my spine, but I pushed it down. It was probably just my imagination, the way the morning shadows stretched long and distorted under the rising sun. I kept going. A few minutes later, a second set of footprints appeared beside the first. These were different, larger, heavier. They didn't start at the beginning of the trail, but instead merged with the first set, as if whoever had made them had suddenly stepped onto the path from the woods. I slowed down, my heartbeat wasn't just from the cold air anymore. I glanced around, scanning the dense trees lining the trail. The forest was silent, still. Nothing moved except for the occasional branch sagging under the weight of fresh snow. But something about the scene felt wrong. The larger footprints followed the first set precisely, matching every step. I picked up my pace, my feet pounding against the snow, the rhythm of my breathing now loud in my ears. The trail curved sharply ahead, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I saw it. Just beyond the curve, the smaller footprints veered off the path and into the woods, but the larger ones continued forward, following me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in quick, visible puffs. I turned around. The trail stretched behind me, empty. The only thing there were the footprints, mine and the ones that had been trailing me. A sudden wave of nausea hit me. I told myself it was just hikers, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, the feeling of being watched. I started running again, this time faster. My ears strained for any sound behind me, but the snow absorbed everything. No rustling, no footsteps, just my own. And then, a branch snapped. Close. I whipped around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The trees stood motionless, their skeletal branches weighed down with snow. My breath came in uneven gasps, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, movement. A figure, just for a second, darting behind a tree. My stomach clenched and my hands trembled, but I forced myself to move. I ran harder, faster, my legs burning with the effort. The path twisted, trees closing in on either side, the world suddenly feeling too small, too quiet. I reached a clearing where the trees opened up, revealing the frozen surface of Mirror Lake below. The footprints, the ones I'd been following, disappeared here. A flood of relief washed over me. Whoever had been ahead of me must have turned off, heading toward the lake or into another trail. They were gone. I exhaled shakily, my heartbeat beginning to steady. Maybe I really had been imagining things. Maybe the person following those smaller footprints had simply gone ahead of me and I'd never seen them leave. I took a deep breath, turning back toward the trail. Then I saw them. A new set of footprints. Fresh, crisp, overlapping mine. Behind me. I froze. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. Someone had been following me. Not ahead, not running alongside. Behind me. I turned around, scanning the trees, my chest tightening. The world felt too still, too silent. And then, the crunch of snow. Close. I turned just in time to see a figure step out from behind a tree directly ahead of me. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and heavy boots. His face was hidden by a hood, his stance too still, too deliberate. He was waiting. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, but for a moment I was paralyzed. Then, he lunged. I screamed and twisted away, my hands clawing at anything, everything. My nails raked across his cheek, and he cursed, his grip loosening just for a second. I didn't waste it. I ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I tore through the snow, my lungs burning, my vision blurred with panic. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cabin appeared in the distance, the sight of it nearly bringing me to my knees. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me, locking it, bolting it, my hands shaking so hard I could barely stand. My family was in the kitchen, staring at me in shock. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The police came, they searched the trail, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no man in the woods. They told me it was probably a transient, someone just passing through. But I know better. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and for one terrifying moment, I was exactly where they wanted me to be. I still think about that morning in Lake Placid, about the footprints, about the figure that lurked just out of sight until it didn't. I think about the way my breath burned in my lungs as I ran, the way my nails scraped against his skin, the way the cold seemed to tighten around me like a vice as I slammed the cabin door shut behind me. The police never found him. They said it was probably just some drifter, some hiker who got too close, but they were wrong. He wasn't lost. He wasn't just there, he was waiting, and I was exactly where he wanted me to be. The memory has stayed with me, creeping up in the quiet moments, the dark ones, the ones where the world feels just a little too still. Maybe that's why I've become obsessed with stories like mine, stories of people who step too far into the unknown and never quite make it back the same. Stories like Olivia Harris's. Olivia wasn't running from anything when she went to the hot springs in Oregon. She wasn't afraid. She should have been. She had worked herself to exhaustion, long shifts at the hospital, blending into sleepless nights, the stress pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She needed a break, a real one, and the idea of slipping into the warm mineral waters of a secluded hot spring sounded like the kind of peace she hadn't felt in months. It was a weekday afternoon when she pulled into the small gravel lot near the springs, the air crisp, the snow piled high around the edges of the trees. Only 2 other cars were there, their windows frosted over. She hesitated for a moment, expecting to see someone, but the lot was empty. Maybe they were already soaking in the pools. Maybe they had gone for a hike. It didn't matter. She was alone, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like a good thing. She grabbed her small backpack, just a towel, water, her phone, and car keys, and made her way down the narrow, snow-packed trail toward the springs. The air smelled clean, untouched, and as she reached the pools, steam rose up in thick clouds, curling around the surrounding rocks like something out of a dream. It was perfect. She stripped down to her swimsuit, tucking her bag beneath one of the wooden benches nearby, out of sight but within reach. The first touch of the water against her skin was bliss, the heat seeping into her muscles, pulling her deeper into a sense of calm she had almost forgotten was possible. She closed her eyes, let herself drift. The only sounds the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of snow, the distant whisper of wind through the trees. But then, something changed. The air shifted. At first, it was nothing. A feeling, a whisper of unease that brushed against the back of her mind. She ignored it. She was just on edge, still unwinding from weeks of stress. But then she realized what was wrong. It was too quiet. The wind had stopped. The distant sounds of the forest had faded. Even the bubbling of the water against the rocks seemed softer, muted. And then, a footstep. Just one. Crunch. A footstep. Just one. Crunch. The endless fustos. Croons. Her eyes snapped open, her breath catching in her throat. She scanned the tree line, her heart pounding now, her skin suddenly cold despite the heat of the water, but there was nothing, just trees, just snow. She swallowed, forcing herself to relax. Probably just one of the other visitors moving around, nothing to worry about. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes again. Crunch. Closer. Her eyes flew open again, but the trees were empty. She stayed still for a long moment, listening, waiting, every nerve in her body on edge. Nothing. No more footsteps, no movement, just the steam rising around her, thick and curling, making the world feel smaller. Finally, she exhaled and shook her head, feeling ridiculous. Maybe she really was just paranoid. Maybe the exhaustion was making her jumpy. She decided it was time to go. Her skin had started to prune, and the last thing she wanted was to freeze on her way back to the car. She reached for her towel, but when she glanced at the bench, her backpack was gone. That horrible bag was gone. It was gone no time. Her backpack was gone. Her breath hitched. No, that wasn't possible. She had tucked it right under the bench, just within reach. She knew she had. She looked around wildly, scanning the rocks, the path, her stomach knotting tighter with every second. It wasn't there. Her heart pounded. Someone had taken it. Someone was here. She forced herself to move, pulling herself out of the water, the cold biting at her skin as she stepped onto the snow-packed ground. Her towel was still there, but nothing else. She called out, "Hey, did someone grab my bag?" No answer. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. And then, footprints, leading away from the bench, away from the springs. She stared at them, her pulse hammering against her ribs. They were fresh, crisp edges, leading into the woods. For a moment she just stood there, her body screaming at her to run, but she couldn't just leave. Her phone was in that bag, her car keys. Without them, she was stranded. Her feet crunched against the snow as she followed the tracks, each step feeling heavier, slower. The footprints led deeper into the trees, winding behind clusters of bare branches. Then, up ahead, her backpack. Sitting against the base of a tree, placed there, deliberately. Something was wrong, she knew it, felt it. But she still took a step forward, then another, and then a man stepped out from behind the tree. She stopped breathing. He was thin, too thin. His skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken deep into his face. His clothes were ragged, filthy, the fabric stiff from the cold. And in his hand, a knife. Her body moved before her mind did. She ran. She didn't think, didn't breathe, just ran, the snow biting into her bare feet, her lungs burning as she sprinted back toward the springs. Behind her, she heard him move. He wasn't chasing her. Not exactly. His steps were slow, deliberate, watching, waiting. She reached the changing rooms and threw herself inside, slamming the door shut, locking it, pressing her back against the cold wood, her body shaking so hard she thought she might break apart. Silence. Then a whisper. Just outside the door, "You shouldn't be here." She clapped a hand over her mouth, biting down on a scream. Then, nothing. The night stretched long, each second an eternity, until the first pale light of morning crept through the cracks in the door. When she finally stepped outside, the world was empty. No footprints, no man, just her backpack, slashed open, the contents scattered across the snow. She never went back, and she never forgot. Some places are meant to be left alone. I believe that now, after hearing these stories, after feeling the chill that lingers long after the winter fades. Emma's morning jog, Olivia's quiet retreat, both moments meant for peace, both shattered by something lurking just beyond sight. There's something about the snow, the way it absorbs sound, the way it hides things that should never be found. Maybe that's why Daniel never saw it coming. Maybe that's why, even now, he wonders if he was ever meant to leave those mountains at all. Daniel Reed wasn't the type to get scared easily. He had spent years traveling, capturing frozen landscapes through his camera lens, chasing the perfect shot across ski resorts and mountain trails. He had seen the wild, had faced nature's raw and brutal beauty, and yet, nothing in his experience had prepared him for Whitefish, Montana. The ski resort wasn't one of the big, well-known ones, and that was what he liked about it. Smaller crowds, untouched powder, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the whole mountain belonged to you. It was perfect. At least that's what he thought when he arrived early that Saturday morning. The sky a brilliant shade of blue, the air so crisp it burned his lungs with every breath. The lot was half empty, just the way he liked it. He grabbed his board, checked his gear, and took the lift up to the higher slopes, already picturing the shots he would get as the sun cut across the peaks. The first few runs were incredible, the kind that made his muscles burn in the best way, the kind that reminded him why he did this, why he chased these places, these moments. Then he saw him. At first, it was just a shape, a figure standing still against the tree line, a dark silhouette against the blinding white of the snow. He barely registered it at first, just another skier taking a break, maybe admiring the view, but as he reached the bottom of the slope and turned back for another run, the figure hadn't moved, still standing there, still watching. Something about it made his skin prickle. He shook it off. Maybe the guy was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just lost in thought. Daniel forced himself to ignore it, pushing back up the lift, ready to lose himself in the slopes again. But when he reached the top and started carving down the side of the mountain, the feeling returned. That itch at the back of his mind, that prickle of awareness, like something just out of sight. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The figure was there again, halfway down the slope now, standing just beyond the trees, still motionless, still watching. A trick of the light, maybe, a weird angle, but something about the way the figure stood, so still, so deliberate, made Daniel's gut tighten. He pushed faster, leaning hard into his turns, trying to shake the feeling that settled deep in his bones. The rest of the day was uneventful. No sign of the man, no more strange moments. By the time the lifts closed, Daniel was exhausted but content, warming his hands around a cup of hot chocolate in the small lodge near the base. Maybe he had imagined it. The mountains had a way of playing tricks on you, shadows shifting in the snow, the cold distorting distance. He convinced himself it was nothing. The next morning, he woke early, eager for one last run before heading home. The parking lot was nearly empty, the mountain wrapped in a thick silence that felt almost unnatural. He took a few warm-up runs on the main trails, but something kept pulling him back to that hidden section, the place where he had seen the figure. He didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to name. He took the lift back up, riding in silence, the wind howling through the open space. When he reached the top, the trail looked untouched. Fresh, pristine snow, no signs of movement. He exhaled, shaking off the tension in his shoulders. He strapped in and pushed off, letting the mountain take him. The world blurred past him, the trees a streak of motion in his periphery. He felt the rush of it, the thrill, the way the world faded away. Then he saw him. This time the figure was closer, standing between the trees, dressed in all black. Black jacket, black pants, black helmet, even the goggles dark and unreadable, just standing there, watching. Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. He forced himself to keep moving, his pulse hammering in his throat. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just some other skier. But even as he tried to reason with himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He picked up speed, carving hard into the snow, trying to put as much distance between himself and the figure as possible. But every time he risked a glance back, they were still there. Not skiing, not boarding, just standing. He pushed faster, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his muscles burning. The bottom of the trail was in sight, safety just ahead. And then, something slammed into him from behind. He went flying, his board detaching, his body hitting the snow hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Before he could react, before he could even process what had happened, hands grabbed him. He struggled, twisting, trying to break free, but the weight on top of him was solid, crushing. Then he saw the face. Or rather, the lack of one, the goggles, the mask covering everything else. A voice, low and sharp, cut through the cold. Wallet, phone. Daniel's breath came in short gasps. He reached into his jacket with shaking hands, pulling out his phone, his wallet. The figure snatched them, then nothing. No final words, no threats, just a shove, sending Daniel sprawling back into the snow. He looked up, blinking against the glare, but the figure was already gone, disappearing into the trees like a shadow. For a long moment, Daniel just lay there. His heart pounded, his mind racing, every nerve in his body still screaming, "Move, move, move." Eventually, he forced himself to his feet, strapping his board back on with trembling hands, making his way down the rest of the slope as fast as his body would allow. He reported it to the lodge staff, but they just shook their heads. No cameras on that part of the trail. No witnesses, nothing they could do. Daniel left that afternoon. He didn't look back. But even now, even months later, the memory lingers, the cold pressing against his skin, the silence of the trees, and the figure in black, watching, waiting, like they had all the time in the world. Some encounters end in escape, like Emma running breathless through the trees, Olivia locking herself away in the changing room, Daniel tumbling down the slopes in desperate retreat. But what if there is nowhere to run? What if the danger is right outside your door, waiting for you to open it? Mark Dawson knows that feeling too well. He thought he was alone in his cabin, that his only company would be the words on the pages he struggled to write. But the thing about solitude is that it makes you easy to find, and some things, in the cold, in the dark, want to find you. Mark had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a secluded writing retreat outside Jackson Hole. Far from the city, far from the noise, far from distractions. He had rented the small log cabin specifically because it was isolated, tucked into the woods with only a long, winding road connecting it to the outside world. The pictures online made it look cozy. A wood-burning stove, big windows facing the snow-covered pines. The perfect place to finally finish his novel. Or at least that's what he had hoped. The first 2 days were exactly what he needed. He woke up early, brewed coffee, and spent the mornings writing, watching the snow fall through the windows as he typed. In the afternoons, he took walks, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, the air so cold it burned his lungs. At night, he sat by the fire with a whiskey, letting the warmth soak into his bones, enjoying the quiet. It was peaceful until the third night. It was around 8:30 p.m. when he heard it. A knock at the door. The sound was soft but deliberate. 3 knocks, not hurried, not desperate, just waiting. Mark froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest house was miles away and he hadn't seen another car or person since he arrived. His first thought was maybe the property owner had stopped by, maybe to check on him or drop something off. But why so late? Why no warning? He stood slowly, heart pounding now, and moved toward the door. "Hello?" he called out. A voice, male, low. "Hey, sorry to bother you. My car broke down just up the road. No service out here. Could I use your phone?" Mark hesitated, every nerve in his body suddenly on edge. There was something off about the voice, too flat, too practiced, like someone reading from a script. "There's no phone here," Mark lied. "No service either?" A pause, too long, then, "Oh, yeah, figures." Silence stretched between them. Mark could hear the wind outside, the crackle of the fire behind him. Then another knock, this time harder. "You sure? Just need to make a quick call." Mark's throat went dry. The way the man asked wasn't a question, it was a test, a probe, a way to see just how much he could push. Mark took a step back, trying to ignore the cold sweat trickling down his spine. "I can't help you," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. Another long pause. Then, just before Mark could exhale in relief, the door handle rattled. Mark's stomach plummeted. His body locked up as the metal handle jerked again, this time harder. "I think it's frozen shut," the man muttered from the other side. "Mind unlocking it?" Mark's pulse roared in his ears. His fingers twitched at his sides. He took another step back. "No," he said, barely above a whisper. Silence. Then the sound of footsteps moving away. Mark let out a shaky breath. His hands trembled as he reached for the fire poker near the wood stove, gripping the iron tightly. He needed to check. He needed to be sure. Slowly, he crept toward the window beside the door, angling himself so he could peek outside without being seen. The porch light barely reached beyond the steps, but he could make out a shape. The man stood just at the edge of the light, not leaving, just standing, watching. He wasn't looking at the door anymore, he was looking at the window. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His body went rigid. The man was smiling, a slow, deliberate grin. Not friendly, not right. Mark yanked the curtain shut. His mind raced. What the hell was he supposed to do? The cabin had no landline, no cell service. His car was parked outside, but that meant stepping out there, into the dark, into the cold, where the man was waiting. Then, a soft tapping on the glass. Mark's chest tightened. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the fire poker so hard his knuckles ached. The tapping continued, rhythmic, patient. "You can't stay in there forever," the man whispered. Mark bolted. He ran straight to the bathroom, locking the door, pressing his back against it, his entire body shaking. The walls felt too thin. The air felt too heavy. For the next hour, the noises continued. Soft footsteps circling the cabin, the sound of something scraping against the wood, a faint chuckle. Low, amused, like the man knew something Mark didn't. And then, nothing. Silence. Mark stayed in the bathroom until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When he finally worked up the courage to come out, the cabin was still empty. But as he stepped outside, his stomach turned to ice. Footprints. Leading from the porch, but not back to the road. They disappeared into the woods. Mark didn't waste another second. He grabbed his things, threw them into his car, and sped down the narrow, winding road without looking back. The police took his statement over the phone when he finally got back to town. Probably just a transient, they said. Someone looking for a place to stay the night? But Mark knew better. He wasn't asking to come in. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment Mark would make a mistake. Waiting for the cold to wear him down. Waiting for the door to unlock. Mark doesn't write in cabins anymore. He doesn't answer knocks at the door after dark. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the wind howls outside his window, he swears he still hears it, the tapping. Soft, patient, like it's waiting for him to open the door. The thing about horror is that it doesn't always end when the story does. It lingers, it clings, it stays in the corners of your mind, waiting for the quiet moments, the stillness, the solitude. Emma still dreams of those footprints trailing behind her. Olivia still flinches at the sound of wet footsteps. Daniel still wonders if the masked figure is out there, watching. Someone else now. And Mark. Mark will never forget the man outside his cabin, the soft tapping, the whisper that made his blood run cold. But sometimes, the worst part isn't escaping. Sometimes, the worst part is what happens when you turn around, expecting to see someone there, only to find nothing at all. Sophia Miller never thought a simple hiking trip would turn into a nightmare. She had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A much-new getaway with her best friends before their final semester of college. The Wasatch Mountains in Utah were breathtaking in the winter, a postcard-perfect backdrop for an adventure. They had rented a cozy cabin in Big Cottonwood Canyon, just a short drive from the Cougar Crest Trail, a popular hiking route known for its stunning views. Sophia had done her research. The trail was moderate, nothing too intense, just enough of a challenge to make the views feel earned. She had planned everything, the snacks, the gear, even a carefully curated playlist for the drive. That morning, the six of them, Sophia, her best friend Katie, Katie's boyfriend Ryan, Sophia's boyfriend Alex, and their two friends Mia and Jordan, set off early, bundled up in their warmest layers. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, the snow glistening under the sunlight. Everything felt perfect. The first hour of the hike was exactly what they had hoped for. Fresh air, laughter, the crunch of snow beneath their boots, the occasional stop for a group photo. Katie and Mia were obsessed with getting the perfect Instagram shots, making the group pause every few minutes while they posed against the snowy landscape. Sophia didn't mind. She liked taking her time, letting the quiet of the mountains sink into her bones. It was at one of these stops that she noticed it, a small break in the trees just off the main trail, leading to what looked like an even better vantage point. "I'll be right back," she called over her shoulder. "I just want to get a quick shot." Alex gave her a playful eye roll, but nodded. "Don't take too long, or you'll get lost in Narnia." Sophia grinned and stepped off the path, her boots sinking slightly into the powdery snow. The clearing wasn't far, just a few steps away, and as she reached it, she was rewarded with a breathtaking view. The valley stretching below, the mountains rising in the distance, untouched snow glistening in the morning light. She lifted her phone to take a picture, and then she heard it, a soft crunch behind her. Her stomach tensed. She turned, expecting to see one of her friends coming to join her. There was no one there. The trees stood silent, unmoving, their bare branches heavy with snow. The air was still. Maybe it was just an animal. A rabbit, squirrel, something small. She forced a laugh at herself and took another photo. Crunch. Closer this time. Sophia's breath hitched. "Guys?" she called out. "If you're messing with me, it's not funny." Silence. The uneasy feeling in her chest deepened. She glanced over her shoulder again, scanning the trees. Nothing. And then, just at the edge of her vision, movement. A figure, standing between the trees. Far enough away that she couldn't see any details, but close enough that she knew it was a person. Sophia's heart slammed against her ribs. She stepped back instinctively, gripping her phone so tight her knuckles ached. "Hello?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up Sophia's spine. She took another step back. "Okay, whatever," she muttered. "I'm leaving." She turned back toward the trail. And her friends were gone. Her breath caught in her throat. The trail had been right there. She had just seen them, heard them. They couldn't have gone far. She took a step forward, her boots sinking into the snow. "Katie?" she called. "Alex?" Nothing. The woods had gone too quiet. The laughter, the distant crunch of boots. Sophia swallowed hard. She turned to look back at the figure. It was closer. No, that wasn't possible. She hadn't heard it move. It was still too far to make out any details. But something about the way it stood, the way it tilted its head slightly, made her stomach churn. Panic gripped her chest. She turned back toward the trail and started walking fast. Her breath came in quick, uneven gasps. Where the hell did everyone go? She could feel it now. Something behind her, the weight of being watched. She started running. Her boots slipped slightly on the icy patches. But she didn't care. She ran, breath coming in short bursts, heart hammering. And then, a hand grabbed her arm. Sophia screamed. She twisted, kicked, fought, her body reacting before her mind caught up. The grip was strong, cold. It yanked her backward, dragging her toward the trees. She screamed again, thrashing wildly, her nails catching on something. Flesh. A guttural snarl tore through the air. She barely registered the pain in her shoulder as she was shoved hard into the snow. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. For a split second, she couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, footsteps. Running. Her friends. "Sophia!" she gasped, forcing herself up just as Katie and Alex came racing toward her. The figure, gone. The trees, empty. Her heart was still hammering as she scrambled to her feet, choking on fear. "What happened?" Ryan demanded, looking around. She turned, searching for any sign of the attacker. Nothing. Just their footprints. And his, leading into the trees. Disappearing into the nothingness. The rangers were called, but they didn't find anyone. No tracks leading away, no evidence, just Sophia's shaken voice telling them, over and over, "Someone grabbed me. Someone was there, but there was no proof, just footprints leading into the snow, just the cold pressing in around them." And sometimes, at night, when Sophia tries to sleep, she remembers the way it felt. That hand on her arm, pulling her, dragging her toward the trees, toward the place where people vanish. Some people escape, some don't. But the ones who do? Emma, Olivia, Danielle, Mark, Sophia. They never truly leave what happened to them behind. The feeling sticks, lingers in the quiet, in the cold, in the spaces where the world feels just a little too still. They survive, but the fear never lets go. It makes me wonder about the ones who don't make it back. The ones whose stories don't end with a chase or a near miss. The ones who just disappear. That's what happened to Lucas Bennett. His story isn't about running away. His story is about walking into something dark and never walking out. Lucas had spent years chasing the abandoned, the forgotten. His YouTube channel, Dead Places, had taken him across the country to ghost towns, condemned buildings, old asylums, anywhere he could capture that eerie, desolate beauty his viewers craved. He had a knack for finding the places that still held echoes of something sinister. So when he found out about Black Hollow Lodge, he knew he had to go. It was an old ski resort in the Adirondacks, New York, shuttered for decades after a series of unsolved disappearances. The guests had vanished without a trace, their belongings still in their rooms, their cars still in the lot, everything frozen in time. Some said it was an accident, a storm, something natural. Others whispered about something else. Lucas didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in stories. And this one was too good to pass up. He arrived alone just before sunset, his camera gear packed, his flashlight cutting through the thick winter fog as he approached the lodge. The place was massive, decayed, its dark wooden structure barely visible through the heavy snowfall. The front doors were ajar, hanging slightly off their hinges, as if someone had stepped inside and never stepped back out. He filmed everything: the empty lobby, the check-in desk covered in dust, the room keys still hanging on the wall. There were tables set for dinner, plates and silverware still in place, as if the guests had gotten up mid-meal and walked away. It was the kind of eerie, untouched decay that made his channel blow up. And yet, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick, the kind of quiet that made his skin crawl. As he moved deeper into the lodge, the feeling grew. The long hallways stretched out too far, like they weren't built to end. The old chandeliers hung too low, casting shadows that moved when he wasn't looking. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Above him. He stopped breathing. The lodge had been abandoned for years. There was no way someone else was here, but the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps, moving across the floor above him. Lucas swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around his camera. He was here to capture everything. This was what he did, so he followed the sound. Up the grand staircase, down a long, dark hall where the air felt thicker, heavier. Every door on the hallway was open, their rooms empty except for the remnants of lives that had once passed through. Suitcases left unzipped, beds unmade, old clothes hanging in the closets. Then, "You shouldn't be here," Lucas froze. The words weren't distant, they were right behind him. His camera slipped in his grip as he spun around. The hallway was empty, the doors slammed shut. Every single one. A deep, deafening silence. His heart pounded. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to keep filming. The footage, that was all that mattered. He had to prove this wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he felt it. Something watching. He lifted his camera, panning the hallway slowly. Then, movement. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the flickering light, something stepped out. Not a person, not a shadow, something else. It was tall, wrong, its body stretched like it had been pulled in directions it shouldn't go, its head tilted too far to one side, and it moved too smoothly, too silently, like it wasn't touching the floor at all. Lucas's breath hitched, his flashlight flickered. The thing took a step forward, and then another, closer. He ran. He didn't think, didn't breathe, just ran, the hallway stretching impossibly long as he bolted for the staircase. His own footsteps felt wrong, like they weren't the only ones hitting the floor. He reached the lobby, shoving through the doors, crashing into the snow. He turned back. The lodge was empty, the doors hung open. Nothing followed, but he knew he wasn't alone. Lucas ran to his car, heart hammering, his camera still clutched in his frozen fingers. He threw himself into the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. His hands shook as he tried again. Nothing. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, a low, echoing sound, curling around the lodge like something alive. Then, the crunch of footsteps, right outside the car. Lucas's breath came in short, ragged bursts. He turned his camera toward the window and saw his own reflection. No, not his. Something standing behind him, something wearing his face. The camera hit the ground. The footage kept recording. But Lucas was gone. By morning, his car was still there, the doors hung open, the engine dead. His camera was found, half buried in the snow. The footage, still playing, showing nothing but the inside of the lodge. Empty. Silent. Waiting. And if you listen closely, if you turn the volume up just enough, you can still hear the whisper. You shouldn't be here. If there's one thing these stories have taught us, it's that danger isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with a bang, a scream, or a warning sign. Sometimes it lingers just beyond sight, waiting in the silence, in the untouched snow, in the places we assume are empty. But they aren't. Emma learned that the hard way when she took that jog through the woods, believing she was alone until the footprints said otherwise. Olivia wanted peace, only to realize that in the stillness of the hot springs, something was watching. Daniel dismissed his gut feeling until the masked figure tore him from his board and left him in the snow. Mark thought the man at his door just needed help, until he whispered, "You can't stay in there forever." Sophia trusted that her friends were just a few steps away, until they weren't, and something else reached for her instead. And Lucas? Lucas didn't believe in ghosts, but whatever took him from that lodge wasn't a ghost. So what can we take away from this? 1. Trust your instincts. Fear is a survival tool, not an inconvenience. If something feels off, if the hair on your arm stands up for no reason, if the silence around you feels too deep, listen to it. Emma didn't listen at first, and neither did Daniel. By the time they understood, they were already running 0.2. Never go alone. Solitude has its place, but these stories remind us that some places are meant to be visited with others. Olivia was alone in the hot springs. Lucas was alone in that lodge. Sophia was alone when she strayed from the trail. They all thought they were safe, until they weren't. 3. The wilderness hides things. Nature is beautiful, but it is also vast, indifferent, and unpredictable. The snow covers evidence. The wind drowns out sounds. The mountains, forests, and abandoned places do not care if you return. And if something in those places doesn't want you to leave, you might not. 0.4. Help doesn't always knock. Mark's story is a chilling reminder that not everyone who asks for help truly needs it. Sometimes people knock because they want you to open the door. Sometimes they are just waiting for you to make a mistake. 5. Not all things that vanish are lost. Lucas disappeared. The police found no signs of a struggle, no signs that anyone had forced him to leave. But we know better, don't we? He didn't walk out of that lodge. Something else took him. At the end of the day, these stories are warnings about what lurks in the forgotten places, about what follows in the snow, about the things that do not want to be seen but are always watching. So if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, on an empty trail, in a quiet cabin, or standing before an open door at night, ask yourself one thing. Are you really alone? Because the answer might terrify you. From the frozen trails to the abandoned lodges, you've traveled with us through these chilling tales of survival, fear, and the unknown. Thank you for unlocking the vault with us tonight. If you've enjoyed these stories, let us know in the comments and share your own. The world is full of dark corners and unsolved mysteries, and maybe you've seen something the rest of us haven't. If you haven't already, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next time we open the vault, you won't want to miss what's waiting inside. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the coldest dangers aren't always the ones you expect.